Hey, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today when I realize that many of you would like to be outside, wouldn't prefer to be outside right now, but would like to be outside as well. So thank you so much. We're really excited today to be hosting Gunjan and Matt, as well as our colleague. Gunjan is the Global Secretary for the Movement for Community Development. Elene, who's joining us today, is the Director of Research and Advocacy at Outreach International. Is the Global Civil Society at Aga Foundation. Some senior research fellow in the Participation, Inclusion, and Social Change Cluster here at IDS. And myself, I'm a researcher also in the Participation, Inclusion, and Social Change Cluster. So we're really excited that Gunjan have very kindly offered to come here to speak about their new edited book, which is out available to purchase. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So I've got chairing duties, but I'm going to keep those very brief, and I'm actually going to pass directly to Gunjan, who's going to introduce the book, the framework for community development. Yeah.
Uh, right. Did you pass it on to me, Mariah? Sorry, the sound was chopping. It was cutting off, so it was very choppy. Uh, yeah. Okay. Well, hello everyone. Just give it, I think, a few seconds as we are figuring out the sound, the tech issue. Gary, let me know when we are good to go with the sound.
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear. Can you hear us?
Yes, we can. Okay, great. I am going to share my screen and we will get started. Just 1 second. Hybrid events are always tricky, right? Figuring out the logistics of it. Do you see my screen?
That's great, Gunjan. We can.
Perfect. So hello everyone. I am, as Mariah said, I'm Gunjan Veda. I serve as the Global Secretary for the Movement for Community-Led Development, and it is very nice to be with you in the virtual space today. So the Movement for Community-Led Development is a majority world-led network of networks. We use the word majority world very intentionally, and in fact, in the book, we also explain why we do so. But it is a reminder to everyone that what is called the Global South is actually where the majority of the world's population stays. We were launched in 2015. So this is our 10th year, actually, at the UN Sustainable Development Goals Summit. And we're a group of over 2,000 local and community-based organizations and their INGO allies from around the world who believe that every person should have a voice in decisions that affect their lives. So we operate through self-organized, self-governed groups of local organizations in different countries, sometimes with country offices of INGOs, sometimes with academics, sometimes with local government. Every country, as you can imagine, looks different. But that's the movement for community-led development, right? I want you to go back a little bit to 2019. So this is the world which is before COVID-19, before the pandemic happened, before all these big commitments that we saw, being inked on locally led development and localization. Now, this was a time when you went up to somebody and said, community-led development is the way to go, people would be like, yeah, sounds nice. What's the evidence that it works? And so I don't know how many people here know this, but the World Bank channelizes 11% of its funding through community-driven programming. And so the World Bank came to the movement and said, you know what? The World Bank really is not CLD. We know that that's not our work, right? But you guys, you do CLD, shouldn't you have the evidence? And that's how in 2019, I got into the movement. And we said, where will we find this evidence of the impact of community-led development? And we said, of course, we are going to find it in our evaluation reports. You know, all these gorgeous evaluation reports that we have sitting in our offices that we never look at. So we asked members for it. Sure enough, it was just the INGOs that had it, but within a week, we got 400 reports. The challenge was not one of those reports, when we looked at it, we could tell that the program was community-led. And we realized that even though we were a movement for community-led development, everybody had a very different understanding of what community-led development was. And frankly, a lot of people had no understanding of it. So if we truly wanted to transform the system and talk about an approach which centers communities, we had to come up with a common understanding of what is community-led development, what does it look like in practice, right? And what are people saying when they think about it? So we channelized the power of a movement. We said that, you know, I shouldn't be sitting and deciding what is community-led development. You know, that would be fun, but probably not something that would work. So we reached out, and more than 100 people from all around the world came together to form a collaborative research team. And over 2.5 years, we worked collectively, literature reviews, discussions, debates. You can imagine, right? A group of practitioners trying to agree on something. So you can imagine the kind of debates and discussions that happened. But we came up with 3 things at the end of it. A landscape review where we looked at 173 programs from 65 countries to understand what is it that people are doing when they say they're doing community-led development. And 2 tools. The participatory CLD assessment tool, which has formed the framing of this book. So the book is actually uses the tool and its framing. It's a tool that's available in 10 languages and being used all over the world, from local governments in Canada and Kenya to INGOs to community-based organizations. And then the last thing we said was, you know, if we're truly serious about community-led development, we also need to rethink about the way we are thinking and doing evaluations. And we need to think about quality of evaluations as more than rigor. Quality has to include principles of community-led development and fidelity to them in it. So we were doing all of this, Elene and I. Elene was a part of the collaborative research team. I had the pleasure of, leading it. And then we suddenly realized, well, this is great. We have the tools, people are using it. But come 2021, the world is trying to understand how to do community-led development. And because this is not a mainstream approach, even though it's an approach that has been there for a very, very long time, people don't know how to do it. And so we kept hearing, okay, so how do we do this? And we realized the need for a volume which exemplifies what community-led development looks like in practice, which offers step by step, because it will look different in every country, and we'll hear more about that today. But there are certain common characteristics that run across that make it community-led development. And shortly, Elene, my colleague, will share with you what these characteristics are for community-led development. So that's kind of how we decided to do this book, right? Because we felt that there was really a need to understand how to do CLD. It's not easy. It sounds simple. It is not simple. It's not easy. It's a lot of back and forth. It's not a linear process. It's a journey, right? So how do we navigate this? Can we learn from the experience of practitioners from around the world who have been doing this for many, many years? Now, of course, before we do that and show you the frame of the book, the question is, well, what do we even mean? How are we defining community-led development? Because as we said, everybody has something different in mind when they think of community-led development. So after a lot of debate, discussion, reviews, this is the definition we came up with, and we have this in the introductory chapter for the book. Community-led development is a development approach where local community members work together to identify goals important to them. They develop and implement plans to achieve these goals and create collaborative relationships internally and with external actors, all the while building on community strengths and local leadership. So yes, it is a process which is led by communities, but it is a process which involves multiple stakeholders in it, right? We also realize that many of the words we are going to be using are words which are contentious, are words which we all see differently. Locally led development is not the same as community led development, is not the same as decolonization, is not the same as localization, is not the same as shift the power, and we hear all of these terms. I'm not going to go into all of them right now. You know, in the introduction, we actually map out how we see these different terms, the relationships that we see between them, and how do we situate our work and the practice of community-led development within all of this. But the last thing that I do want to say before I hand it to Elene is the definition of community. Because community, as we know, is not, it's not, again, a concept that everybody thinks the same about, right? At any given point in time, we inhabit multiple communities of faith, of practice, of region, religion, ethnicity, gender. There's so many communities that we can be a part of. So in community-led development, often, and in the work of organizations in this volume, when we talk about community, we're talking about a place-based community. But we're very aware of the fact that this community is a negotiated concept. It's a construct and it's constantly evolving. So as we work together with communities, which are not these inclusive spaces we would like them to be, right? Communities by nature are exclusionary. There is a constant negotiation going on, the to and fro, the collaborative relationships between the external and the internal actors that you see on the slide, where the idea of community is being made and remade. So with that, Elene, I'm going to hand it to you to share a little bit more about our framework that we use for this book.
Thank you, Gunjan. Yes, so as Mariah said earlier, my name is Elene, and I'm the Director of Research and Advocacy at Outreach International. We're one of the partners and one of the organizations that's part of the movement. And as Gunjan also mentioned, I had the joy of also working with her in part of the working groups. And also, as Gunjan was saying, when we developed the participatory community-led assessment tool, and also in doing the landscape review, we identified characteristics across the board through a representative in different organizations' definition and also interpretation of community development. And then those characteristics we put together to become the 9 dimensions of community development. And these 9 dimensions of community development then also became really productive for us to structure our volume around and our contributions and our cases of how and what community development looks like in practice. And then, so this became the framework of our book. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. We do elaborate on these dimensions in the book, but just to briefly go through them, when it comes to community development, participation, inclusion, and voice is, of course, an immediate dimension, an immediate concept that comes to mind. It is crucial, in our opinion, with regard to community development, that it's not only about participation, but it's also about who is included and who is not, and also to what extent they have voice and not voice when participating, and also whether they have choice on whether they do want to contribute their voice or not. The next dimension is about local knowledge and resources, asking the question about whose knowledge, whose resources are incorporated, who has choice over the matter. If it's local resources and local knowledge, how are those resources and knowledge contributed by whom and to what extent? Sustainability and exit strategies is another dimension that's of importance. The dimensions So when we started out the volume, exit strategies was part of the dimensions, but what is so amazing about that, the process of writing the book and also the chapter focusing and unpacking and describing exit strategy is that chapter actually looks at exit strategy in a little bit of a critical way and thinking about exit strategy as rather changing the relationship between actors, right? In not completely concluding the work and just exiting, but rather to think, is our partnership shifting, right? Who and what are we, and how do our roles change? Then there's, of course, accountability, which is a concept that is very well known of and very well debated. And within community development, it's about the direction of the accountability, right? Who holds who accountable and to what extent? So multi-directional accountability. Local context is, of course, undebatably very important, and Matt will talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. Collaboration is crucial. We have some really good ways or good chapters talking through and thinking through what collaboration looks like in practice. Who is collaborating? How crucial is collaborating of existing social structures within communities toward community development being successful and impactful? And such collaboration then also touches on working with subnational governments. We have some chapters in the book that really unpacks the importance of having relationships with local government and then using that to work toward community development goals and processes and practice. And then you will see the last two dimensions are colored a little bit differently. It's because we interpret those as processes, whereas the other 7 are more characteristically leading. Those 2 are processes with regard to monitoring evaluation. Asking the question, to what extent are communities involved from the start of monitoring evaluation all the way to the end? And involved is maybe not the right word to use. A better word maybe is to use to what extent do they have ownership over the process of monitoring evaluation, from designing the evaluation question, what is it that they want to get out of the monitoring evaluation, all the way to disseminating the evidence. And we found, and we also know from a chapter in the book and also from other work, that when people are involved in the monitoring evaluation process, they take so much ownership over the results of that evaluation that they are super eager to then change and to share it and then use the information to advocate for what's best within their contexts. And then lastly is, of course, facilitation, which is a cornerstone of our work, right? In that we are facilitating across different actors the work that is community development, rather than other concepts than top-down teaching or trainings per se. And then also, of course, facilitation. What we are curious about within community development is the quality of such facilitation. Is there ongoing reflections and monitoring and evaluation of the quality of facilitation, and to what extent are facilitating processes evolving? And here, for example, a core thing that comes to mind is if you have practitioners facilitating community development processes, to what extent are they reflective of what they do and their power relations and so on and so forth. All right, so our objective of the book was then to incorporate as much as possible diverse voices into the volume. We feel very chuffed about the collection of contributors that we have within the volume. It includes academics, it includes people from INGOs, writers, but then also practitioners at a local level, practitioners from national nonprofits, and then also community-based organizations and practitioners, and then founders of such organizations contributing to the book. And here you can see a very nice reflection of such contributors, and then also how our goal was to expand as much and involve as much as the global south, as the majority world as possible, across different contexts. Okay, I think that is it. Oh, there's one more thing that I wanted to add about scale and place. Gunjan, if you can go to the next slide. Thank you. We were also intentional about incorporating examples of community development, how it happens across scale, right? From very, very smaller scale, community-based organizations and nonprofits, all the way through to bigger examples of that. And there is a QR code in case you are interested to see where it lives on Routledge's website. And we did hear from them that there's a little bit of a discount currently going for the book. All right, Gunjan, I think this is now just the right place to move us into the video. So we put together a video to give you an additional or a deeper feel of who the contributors are, and also with each of them sharing a sentence or two of and about their chapter.
When you bring together a diverse group of people and pool together their knowledge, their experiences, their learnings, that is what our world needs right now, because no one player or part of the system can actually bring about the transformational changes we are talking about. It requires each one of us. And that is what the book showcases to me, that if we are able to really build on our individual strengths in a collective manner, we can do it.
Our quest and the quest for community-led development was seen by practitioners always as a movement for liberation, as a movement to end colonialism. It's not just a better way to do development.
What we have learned over the years is actually getting ourselves engaged with communities in a different way that build spaces so that they themselves can use their own voice. Community-led development interventions that are adaptable, flexible, and thrive on equity, consensus, and partnership actually empower the community.
Successful projects, they don't look the same. Like when the program seems to be more successful was when the communities took the program and rearranged it in the way that it works for the communities.
Within each of our communities, there's someone who has expertise. But unfortunately, most of these structures usually work in silos. How do you leverage the power within the communities? We know it is there, and that is what our chapter directly feeds into us.
We look at the network in Benin, asking everyone, are you really happy with the way we are implementing developments? If you are not satisfied with just one single aspect, you are welcome to MCLD.
There is a need for mutual respect. You need to sort of have equity and pluralism embedded in your approach. Then give priority to the empowering process over the efficient approach. NGOs and project managers love efficiency and sacrifice empowerment at the altar of efficiency. And this says that to create good community organization, empowering is more important than efficiency.
It just so happened that Engineers Without Borders was looking for someone like me to do a project in Guatemala. You know, they wanted to essentially do community-led development. And I was essentially the facilitator for all of this. And I think part of my message is, you know, constant adjustment, more time, and development organizations of whatever size and shape usually don't plan that. The best development is not constricted or constrained by such limitations.
ABCD, or asset-based citizen-led development, addresses the internalized powerlessness and dependency of community members. Realize that they have assets, strengths, and capabilities valuable to their own well-being and the well-being of the whole community.
We were dedicated and committed to community-led development from the beginning, but what we did not realize is the depth of dynamics between the international and the local. Our chapter is about that journey. We wrap up by explaining when we did move out of the way, the successes and progress were enormous.
I thought the constellation SALT approach would work really well. And here we are using it in with 12 NGOs in South Asia. So the NGOs are assessing their own progress, and our role is to trust the capacity of people, deeply listen, appreciate, and learn from their experience.
We try to narrate the story of Sarvodaya, its vision, its philosophy, its approach, the model and everything, and to emphasize the spirit of transformation, which is exemplified by the theme that we used: we build the road builds us. Because we try to achieve a physical objective, but in the process, we transform ourselves spiritually and based on our values.
If you have an idea and you seek out folk with energy, with like-minded energy toward establishing something, you can get things done. It's just possibility. And this for me is just the beginning of such possibilities.
Wonderful. Can I think people can hear me online, I hope. Yes, wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing, Elene and Gunjan. I think now we're going to pass to Matt, who has a chapter in the book, but you're going to speak directly to us about Advocacy Foundation and your work with them.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you so much. It's great to see the people here, and also those of you online. I noticed that some of my colleagues are online as well, so shout out to those of you who are. So yeah, I just wanted to give a little bit of context about the Aga Khan Foundation. I don't know how familiar people are, and if we can go to the next slide, we work across a lot of different areas. If you've traveled around the world, you might have seen Aga Khan schools, you might have seen Aga Khan hospitals, but a lot of the work that we do as the foundation is rooted in communities and works through and with local civil society groups around issues, using community-led development to address issues of agriculture, food security, climate resilience, etc. If we can move. Yeah. Fantastic. So, and our work with civil society was really championed by the previous Aga Khan, who passed away earlier this year, who described civil society as one of the most powerful forces of our time. And he also said that civil society around the world should be vigorously encouraged and wisely nurtured. And so that would really take us as kind of the basis for our work with communities. And again, if we can move on. So our journey with community-led development dates back to the early 1980s, when we began to make strategic investments in Gilgit-Baltistan Chitral in northern Pakistan and in Gujarat in western India. And we started there by forming village-level organizations and women's organizations that running through participatory rural appraisal processes with them to develop their own plans that they could work towards. I'm gonna say we. When I say we, I mean the Aga Khan Foundation. I wasn't doing this work in the late 80s. I was in primary school, and actually, I'm not personally doing the work that I described today. It's my colleagues around the world who are doing that work. The work in northern Pakistan and in India became so successful. It was recognized by the World Bank, and so that it became a model for the rest of our work around the world. And so in the early 2000s, we really began to take this approach to community-led development to other parts of the world, including northern Afghanistan, the Swahili coast of East Africa, Aswan, and even eventually into urban Lisbon and Porto in Portugal. And this is where we came into the book, because we were asked to tell a little bit about our experience of doing that, of taking community-led development approaches and applying them in different contexts. So what did that look like? And if we can move again. Fantastic. So this is my last slide. So these are the various geographies in which we work, and where we took community-led development too. And so to build out the chapter, I started having conversations with my colleagues who are doing this work around the world. And what I wanted to do was share with you just a few of the insights that came out through doing that. So I spoke to my colleagues who were working in Aswan in Upper Egypt, and as they started to build their work in community-led development, they realized that whereas in Pakistan and India, where we were working, we had mobilized communities and formed organizations, in every village in Aswan, there was already a village-level organization called a Gamea, and these Gameas had been set up by the socialist government back in the 1960s, and they were largely dominated by elder men, and they were largely raising funds for marriages and funerals, etc. But what we realized as we reached out and started to have conversations with these groups was that we needed to work with them because they had trust in the community. They had that long-term basis in the community, and so we work with them. And it's a very long process, but we are gradually seeing change in terms of women taking up leadership in the Gamea, in terms of different opportunities to engage in food security, to engage in livelihoods, work with women there, etc. And so that was immediately a very different way of working than we had in Pakistan and India. We also took this work to the Swahili coast of Africa, to northern Mozambique. In the early 2000s, the Mozambican government was going to decentralize some budget to the local level government for community development. So we thought, great, this is a really good opportunity to invest in mobilizing community organizations in northern Mozambique. And unfortunately, the money never materialized at the local level in Cabo Delgado. But we formed these organizations nonetheless, and they really came into their own as the insurgency in northern Mozambique developed in the last 5 years or so. Because what happened was in the north of Cabo Delgado, where the insurgency was, many people had to leave their homes. There was a large movement of IDPs. But people that have been involved in community-led organizations sought out the equivalent organizations in villages further south. And so when they went into a community, they wanted to find out, is there a village organization here? How can we get involved? And although there was a large and very necessary humanitarian response, the village organizations were able to play a very different role in terms of welcoming people in. So our team there told me a story about how the village organizations invited the IDPs to clear the pathway to the cemetery, which is a very local thing that they do as a community, and being invited to be involved in that created a sense of belonging that goes above and beyond having shelter and something to eat. We also took this work to Portugal, to urban Lisbon, and more recently Porto. And so one of the issues we had when we went there was we were a lot less well known there than we were in places like Pakistan and India, Afghanistan, etc. And so we really had to spend a lot of time reaching out to the communities, and also we had to ensure that the first things that we did were very much the things that the communities valued. And so there was a lot of interest in IT skills, and so we started by setting up schools for information technology, computing, etc. And that became our entryway into doing lots of other things. Of course, one of the big advantages of working in Lisbon is that the municipalities do have some money, and so we've been able to connect community associations. And you'll notice that these groups have different names in all of these different places that we work. These community organizations to municipal funds to do what they call community innovation projects. And that's become a key part of our work in Portugal. To sort of sum up some of the things that we learned, what we do in each of these contexts and what we call the organizations in each of these contexts is different. But the values, I think, as Gunjan said right at the beginning, the values that underpin that work are transversal. Values of pluralism, long-term approach, inclusion, etc. And then another thing that we've learned is that, you know, investments in community-led development are never wasted. You know, we have times when it seems like, you know, we work in Syria, we work in Afghanistan, etc. We have times when it seems as though we're not going to even be able to reach these communities that we are working with. But things shift, things change, and there, you know, we find that the social capital that is generated through this work transcends long periods of time, and it's very possible to go back into communities, or you'll go into communities and find things have continued nonetheless. And so, yeah, those are just a few of the observations, I think, from Jackie I wanted to share. Oh, and I do have one more slide at the end. If you would like to find out more about our work, we too have a QR.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matt. Really appreciate it. I was rapidly jotting down notes of things that I want to follow up on and maybe speak. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. See you.
See everybody. Thanks. Yep. There we go. We're gonna now move to Marina, who has some reflections for us, based on the work at IDS, but also more broadly. So Marina, over to you.
Thanks very much, Mariah and everyone. Can you hear me okay? Just starting with that.
Yes.
You can hear me? Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to share a few reflections on what I must say is a really impressive book. I think the way in which you described, Elene, the intention with the scope, but also the diversity of voices, and showing us the video, I think is a nice way to kind of give us a bit of a sense of what's in it. So as I've been reading through bits and pieces of it, I've pulled out a few very sort of biased, obviously, threads of things that resonated with me, but also threads that link to some conversations that Gunjan, myself, and others have been involved in around moving evaluation into more CLD congruent, I think is the language that Gunjan would use, when we're trying to understand how community-led, community-owned, participatory programs, initiatives work. And then I'm also going to try and connect some of the threads into what's happening in the research cluster at IDS, the Participation, Inclusion and Research Cluster, where we've been going through a bit of a strategy renewal process. So we're very much thinking about the future right now and how we want to build on the past and kind of move into work that really speaks to the current moment. So that's what I'm going to try and do in a few minutes, is to pull some of those threads together and hopefully open up the conversation for us in the Q&A and dialogue to think a little bit about the relevance of all this work to the future of the work that those of us working in participation do, but more broadly, I think, for development. So I want to start with just noting how powerful the 9, I think you called them dimensions, I was going to call them principles, but the 9 dimensions that make up your framework are as a structuring device. So you kind of explained briefly what each of them refers to. And I think they work really, really well in the book as a way to structure a really accessible volume. So there's so much in it, but having that structure allows one to kind of dip in and out, depending on what your interest is and depending on what you might be thinking about at any point in time. And what this then does also, I think, is actually achieve striking a balance, which I certainly struggle with this always in my own work, between being able to really bring to life the nuanced, rich, context-specific narrative stories of what this work looks like, feels like, but in a way that isn't simply saying these are boutique solutions that only serve the local and are only for those of you who are already values aligned, right? So I think what you've done in the book is kind of push the conversation a bit forward into how does this kind of approach create deeper, lasting change, and how does that help us to think about scale, right? Particularly the chapters that focus on collaboration. So with governments, and Matt, you just described some of it as well, with local governments, with other actors and systems, all of that, I think, really brings to life the kind of value and relevance of the work to broader processes of change. I really like the chapters that are in part 4 of the book around sustainability and ethical exit. And Elene, you alluded to how it was sort of a bit of a critique of exit strategies, etc. And I really enjoyed the chapter, which is a conversation between the 2 authors, right? And you heard one of them, Chad Bissonnette, in the video there. So a founder of a US-based organization that was working in Haiti. And the chapter is written as a conversation between him and the second author, Louino Robillard, who's a Haitian leader, right, who's running a local organization. And it's just really lovely the way that chapter tells a story of transition, right, that I think kind of invites us all in this moment as we're thinking about who are we in the minority world, you know, someone like myself working in a place like IDS, what does it mean to be in allyship? And what does it mean to think about how those relationships and partnerships evolve? So, I mean, that's just one example, but there are many other examples in the book where I think you bring this, or the authors have brought honest accounts, sometimes actually creating quite a lot of vulnerability that help to ground us, right, from the conversations of the big ideas about decolonizing and localizing into like, what does that actually feel and look like to be in a moment of transition like that? So I really valued that. And then another thread is some reflections you make on how relational the work is. So in the introductory chapter, you say somewhere that I think you say CLD celebrates the relational infrastructures of communities. And that phrase just kind of, stayed with me as I was reading through. So we've been in the cluster, we've been doing quite a lot of work thinking about relational dimensions of systems. And actually that's sort of part of our current strategy, is to really ask this question of what is the role of locally owned, locally driven, locally led processes of change? How do they open up pathways to shift relational dynamics and systems? Do they nurture? Do they build? Do they disrupt? Do they improve? Do they reconfigure, is often language that's used in the kind of systems change world. And there's one chapter in the book that does this really quite explicitly. And it's the chapter you heard the gentleman from the CLD Benin network in the video as well. So one note on this chapter, it opens with a really powerful statement about leaving egos and logos behind, as it describes why the chapter is authored by the network, a network of, I think it's over 1,000 civil society organizations in Benin, which is also quite an interesting thought, sort of provocation for those of us in academic spaces who value authorship and value publications. How might we need to transform the way we think about authorship to be more congruent with our values and the change we're trying to create? So apart from having that great piece in it as a chapter, if they can go, it goes on then to tell the story of how this movement in Benin kind of was built. And it's all about building on relational capital, being very intentional in weaving networks, right? And kind of centering relationships, which, it's told in a very sort of clear way. And then it gets to what was my favorite bit of the chapter, which is talking about how the movement arrives at a community-led view of systems change, right? And so they talk about starting to work with the water of systems change model. So this is a model that I'm sure many of us on this call and in the room use. I've certainly been using it recently for evaluation of systemic action research programs and asking this question of what kind of pathways to systems change might be opened up. So they talk about using this model, and as they're reflecting on it, they realize that it's full of biases, right? It's biased towards funders. It has this external gaze. Indeed, it has been critiqued for being colonial. So they don't just throw it out and say, well, this doesn't serve us. What do? But they work with John Canier himself, who created the model, and they adapt it, they tweak it, they improve it, they make it a model that works in their context. So instead of focusing on shifting mindsets, which is problematic for many reasons in terms of it often being driven by an external perception of what mindsets are right or wrong, it talks about a growth mindset at the heart and kind of at the starting point of the process of change. They include things like mutuality and other kind of indigenous relational concepts alongside power dynamics and relationships. And I thought this was just a really powerful example of how, if we start from the experiences of those who are in the practice, right, how might we build better models, right? How might we tweak the models we already use so that they're fuller, they're richer, and they can tell a better, a more robust story of how these approaches work. So that was another piece that I was pleased to see something explicitly about system change in the book as well. So what kind of landing on what is the relevance of all of this learning that's in the book, but also I think more broadly, Gunjan, and the work that you do at the Movement for Community-Led Development and all of the many thousands of organizations that are part of it. What's the relevance of that to kind of where we are now and where we're headed? Well, I think for starters, you've already made a really important contribution into sort of building the evidence base, which is, Gunjan, where you started the story, about the value of these approaches. And it's interesting to think about kind of what is that evidence base, who develops it, right? And what roles do we each play in that process? Because that's definitely something that we do at IDS, and it's something that is kind of central to our cluster strategy. And we're opening up new avenues of work around that. So one example, just to mention briefly, is an engagement with a coalition of organizations, the Full Spectrum Coalition, which includes actually One Village Partners, who there's a great chapter by Chad McCordick and colleagues that talk about their community-led development work in Sierra Leone. So this coalition includes OVP, but also Tostan, Legado, and ID Insight. And it's essentially a new conversation where we're building out an evaluation research agenda precisely on how does, in the language that group is using, holistic community-led development work. So quite a kind of parallel process to what you've described, Gunjan and Elene, and the book itself. So what can I take from what I've read and what I've heard today to kind of nourish that work? Well, there's the point that's made by Ritu and colleagues at the Constellation in the chapter they have on their community life competence process, and they sort of essentially make a case for how you embed evaluation and research in, through, and the kind of facilitated process of community-led development. So that's definitely something that many of us, I think, at IDS do and practice. But then I think the second thing I'm thinking about is the 9 dimensions themselves, right? So how do they help us maybe structure a conversation across similar initiatives? So I think there's opportunities for us to refine our theories through ongoing inductive reasoning. So that's how you develop them in the first place, right? It was starting with the practice. It was starting with what people were doing, and then inductively lifting that up and then looking across different contexts in the way that Matt sort of was describing. So yeah, and as we do more work in more different contexts, ones that are much newer to us, and Mariah's going to talk a bit about the work in the UK, but picking up, Matt, on your point about the work in Lisbon, like what it took to think about the relevance of that approach. That's where this ideal of transferable or portable middle range theories, right? So what is it that helps us understand what matters in different contexts? So we can hold that balance of, what does it really look specifically in different places? But then also, how do we look across those to build a more robust evidence base that helps us kind of collectively push for more of this kind of work to happen because of the broader relevance that it holds for development. So I think I'll stop there. But yeah, I really, really enjoyed reading the book. So thank you for the opportunity. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very, very much, Marina. I now have the really challenging job of following everyone else who has spoken. I'm going to keep what I say very brief, but I wanted to bring it to an example of a project that the participation cluster is working on currently in the UK. And then when I was going through the book and looking at the dimensions, one of the ones, the process dimension that really spoke to me was this idea of facilitation. And I'm going to cheat and directly read what the book describes as facilitation. So in the book, they say facilitation within the context of community-led development captures the processes of engaging people towards co-creation, planning, and implementing collectively envisioned development. In this case, facilitation is participatory development. It is how change happens, not a top-down prescriptive way, but instead through co-creation, collaboration, and inclusive engagements. And reflecting on this, I thought about some of the work that I'm deeply involved in the UK, in the borough of Ealing in London. And as part of this project, I think in a way that might be not necessarily unique, but less usual in the community development space, we were invited by the local government to take part in their health determinants research collaboration. This is a 5-year, £5 million project funded by the UK National Institute for Health Research. And it's a partnership between local community organizations, academic partners like IDS, there are several other academic partners, and the local authority, Ealing Council. And Ealing Council very explicitly wants to change the way that they do research within their council, but more importantly, how they engage with the community and how community and the members of the community are involved and inform the decisions that are made around health, particularly to tackle health inequality in Ealing, which has some of the worst inequality outcomes in terms of health in all of the UK. A major component of this work is systemic participatory action research. And this is the component that my colleagues and I are specifically working on as part of the HDRC. And within this component, there's the role of what I would call myself as a facilitator, the facilitation of community researchers who are involved in the systemic participatory action research. But I wrote here in my notes that, I see facilitation as moving towards being obsolete, but actually you put it much better. Actually, it's an exit strategy or sustainability that is kind of the goal of facilitation. And I think something else that we're really lucky about is because we've been invited by the council, there's a real emphasis on facilitation that works on, but also within the system or systems. So not just related to health inequality, but also the systems which determine how community members are engaged in the work that the council does, how community members are involved in decision making, particularly decision-making that affects the outcomes in their health and how they experience health and living in that community. So recognizing that it's not possible to co-create or be collaborative if you're only working with one interested party. So if you're only working with community members, you can only go so far. But when you start to look at the system and across the system and the different actors who have stake within that system, there's a role to play in almost supporting and preparing the different components of the system to work together in a way that's sustainable, that doesn't require an external facilitator. Because I am, as much as, you know, it's a UK context, I am, and my colleagues are, we're very much external to the people and the community that make up Ealing, or Ealing Council, or, you know, recognizing the council is also part of the community in these kind of complicated relationships. And I was also thinking about kind of the role of facilitation as being multi-directional. So there's kind of the type of facilitation that we undertake with the cohort of community researchers. This is really, for us at least, around not necessarily building skills or capacity, because those already exist, but building confidence in those skills and capacity, so that the community researchers and the organizations that they work with feel empowered to be part of the system and the change that's happening. There's also the role that we play in terms of, and this I would say is actually, I would say, training for the local authority, right? How do they interact with community? How do they see their role? How do they see the role of the community partners and the community members and researchers, about recognizing different forms of knowledge and expertise and really moving beyond a rhetoric of service provision and more into the idea of sharing strengths and challenges and what are actually really resource poor environments, if you think in the context of local authority, particularly these days. They're really resource strapped. They recognize that there's a lot of need that they can't meet. And then I think, you know, of those two kind of facilitation hats that we might wear, there's the piece that's the most important piece. And this is the piece, I think, that talks about that co-creation, collaboration, exit strategies. It's about supporting the relationship between the local authority and the community researchers. So this is about supporting each group to work in ways which are empowering for both groups and readjust assumed power differentials. And the reason I say assumed is because I think there's a perception often, you know, that local authority has this power, and it can feel really disempowering if you're a member of the community going to, for example, the housing office, you're in temporary accommodation. They're telling you that if you want something more permanent, you have to move 6 hours from anybody you know or any context you're aware of. And from the perspective of the community member looking for housing, that person, it feels like they have all the power. But then, you know, you speak to another part of the system, you speak to the housing officer, and they have no housing stock. And they feel just as disempowered in that situation where they can't, you know, support a family that they want to. But what happens is those two groups, they don't often get to have conversations about their own strengths and limitations. So part of this is about creating spaces that are safe for those conversations, but then also creating change within the system and the way that these systems operate so that those conversations can take place more frequently. So just, that was really brief. I invite you to learn more about the project. But I guess kind of a final provocation, I guess I had, thinking about community-led development in practice, but also I would say taking the dimensions that you have laid out so beautifully in the book, and kind of applying them to our global context, if that's even possible at such a scale. But I think about, you know, the kind of current state of affairs in multiple nation states, including this one, where I'm from in the US, where we see top-down agendas which disadvantage and exclude the most kind of marginalized and vulnerable populations, but also the extreme polarization that exists in populations between interests and people, and thinking about how we can apply the or the dimensions of community-led development to kind of bridge some of those vast gulfs between interested parties. So I want to thank you guys again. And online, Marina and Gunjan, thank you so much. Hopefully we have plenty of time for questions now. So Marina has very kindly offered to screen the online, not screen, that's not the right word, to collate and look at, because I cannot see currently the online questions, but I think I'll give her a moment to do that, and perhaps we could take, if there are any questions in the room for either our speakers online or those in the room. We've got one in the back really quickly. Yeah.
Sorry, standing is too hot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Maddie. Thank you so much. It was really such a good discussion. I work at IDS, but I'm also director of a very local food house here in East Brighton. And I saw the description of community development and was like, yep, that's correct. Like, that's definitely what we're doing. And the 9 dimensions as well, I felt very, like, I hope to reach all of the 9 dimensions in different capacities, right? Because we're such a small team. I was curious about the Alliance's relationship with, like, the decolonization and colonization conversation, and also the word development and how people felt about it. And I feel something that was missing from the presentation was kind of what everybody's actually working on in each of these individual groups. Like, what are actually the themes and topics which they're discussing? Is it focused on that topic of decolonization and empowerment, or does it range? Like, I focus on food, but obviously empowerment and uplifting marginalized voices is super connected to that. So yeah, I was just curious about the decision to focus on the majority world. And I appreciate you bringing that term because I hadn't heard of it before. And I'm really glad that there's a different term than global south and global north. I'm like getting tired of it. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Batty. How do you guys feel? Should I take 3 questions and then you guys can divide them up between yourselves? I'll do that. So I saw Peter and then I saw Erica, and then I'll come back to both of you. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Really great presentations, and I'm going to buy the book. So well done for winning another purchase. 2 points. I was on another call this morning. Actually, this is in the context of equity, strengthening equity in research systems, which Erica was also involved in these projects as well. And the question came up about voice, which Elene, you talked about in the framework. And one of the things that's coming up in those conversations through various workshops which are taking place in different parts of the world is a frustration of this idea about voice, that, yeah, voices are being heard, but are they actually listened to? And the term was used this morning about decolonized listening, which I thought was quite an interesting idea. It's another label or another term, but I just wondered, you know, kind of how you've dealt with that. I'll probably find out more when I read the book, but this big question of the sense of, yes, community-led development is about bringing voices, but voices are often not heard. Mariah, you just raised the example in a housing association. You could hear somebody's voice about the need to find accommodation, but the housing officer doesn't have anything that they can do. So then does that person feel, well, my voice hasn't been heard? So this is a very prevailing issue, and it's comes up over and over again. I just wondered how you've grappled with that. And then really quickly, the other question was about learning. So in the framework, you've got a lot of different elements, but the word learning doesn't appear. When you talked about the book, Marina talked about all the learning that came out of it. Matt, you were talking about learning that comes up through working in Portugal. So you're referring to learning a lot. And I just wondered how you see learning, because obviously the world is, as we know, is changing very, very rapidly. Everyone's experiencing rapid change and turbulence. Seeing learning and adaptation seem really central to everything we're doing. So does it fit across everything, or is it in some areas of your framework? Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Erica.
I feel a bit bad adding my questions to what is already I'll throw them into the pot, because I had two. Well, first of all, I'm Erica Nelson. I'm also a research fellow here at IDS, but even about the two of you, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm also going to buy the book and make my students read it. I'm running it into training processes, and because I work a lot in the health space and in health systems, I'm always coming up against one challenge, and I was curious if it came up for you. So I have two questions. One is about the digital. So about where the local isn't a material place, but you're starting to engage much more with sort of virtual forms of community engagement, community development, and how, I don't know, I was just curious where that fits within the 9 principles or practices, and if there's some sort of different configuration of those that one has to think about when you start to engage in these sort of non-material community realities. I suppose that also sort of relates to groups that do not land anywhere, like where, because in health, a common challenge that health planners, health policymakers have when they're trying to do anything community engaged, when they're dealing with sort of migratory populations, migrating populations that fall outside of national boundaries. And so you get to these sort of things that don't fit into either of the categories of how development is thought about what communities are and where they're like physically located. So that was one question, just curious what came up in these conversations. And the second was about this evidence, and I was thinking about Marina's prompting about thinking of the future, but also knowing, I know quite a bit about the long history of community participation, community forms of development, and these debates that are very long standing around like what evidence is count, what is rigor, what is data. And I wondered, since we're now in a very different geopolitical reconfiguring of the aid landscape, if maybe that question is going to be asked differently and by whom. So if you have any sense of sort of as new types of influential aid actors are in this emerging world of what development is, if this question about what constitutes evidence in a community-led space is going to also shift.
Thank you, Erica.
Sorry, I know, big questions.
Big questions for the 4 of you. I'm going to exclude myself from having to answer any of them. I didn't know if anyone wanted, we'll just go in order. Maddie's question around themes and topics that people work on. Did anyone feel particularly strongly about answering that question?
Maybe, Gunjan, I can go on that one. So that's a wonderful question. I want to start with the last part of your question where you said, so why are you focused on the majority world, and why are there not case studies included from the minority world? And that was a very interesting and a deep conversation that Gunjan and I had, because there are marvelous examples of how these dimensions manifest in areas differently defined, so even maybe in digital spaces, you might find examples of that. I don't know, but that would be an interesting space to explore. But for example, in the minority north, we know of beautiful examples out of Canada. Gunjan has worked with groups in Canada that have worked with this, and so on and so forth. We had to make the choice because the book can only be that big or that long. And so we had to just, for the sake of scope down, and we decided to focus just on the majority world, potentially for now. And then you do bring up the question about, so what is actually the topics within the book? And there are very explicit examples of public health, where organizations or chapters unpack. For example, what comes to mind, Gunjan, is the chapter on early childhood marriages, early pregnancies as a public health challenge, and within Uganda, and then what kind of processes do communities then activate, and what social structures do they activate to analyze this as a challenge within the areas. But then we also have chapters that talk a little bit more, or that unpacks the bigger questions. And what comes to mind, Gunjan, is the chapter that focuses on development or methodologies around community development that started in the Philippines, and how those in a majority world context have informed more INGOs within the globe, in the minority world. There's sort of this idea
it's, you know, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, that there was a flow of supposed methodologies from the global north to the global south, from the minority world to the majority world. And that chapter actually illustrates that community development in this context went the other way. You know, it informed in a different direction. Anything to that, Gunjan, that you might want to add, or did I miss anything?
No, you covered it beautifully. I just wanted to add a couple of things, you know, just because you mentioned the word, majority world, Maddie. So it was a term that was coined by Bangladeshi photographer Shah Alam in the 1990s. And it's really interesting because I love that term. In the movement, we love it because it came from the majority world. It was his way of reminding people that we talk about democracy all the time and we value democracy, then how is it that a minority of the world's population is imposing decisions on a majority of the world's population, right? Because that's how decision making flows in our world. But it was also a way for us to remind ourselves in the majority world that we do have agency, right? We do have voice. Linking to Peter's question, which I, will come to, I'm sure, shortly, but it was a reminder for ourselves. And the last thing I wanted to say, because the term decolonization came up, is there are very different ways, and decolonization itself was a very discussed term, right? And there's so many definitions and points of views. We could do a whole book on decolonization. But we have adopted a very specific approach to decolonization in the book. And that's the approach that we feel is congruent with community-led development, because again, they're not the same, they're different things, they're interconnected. And there is an approach to decolonization that Tavono Hadrian, who is from South Africa, has spoken about, which is based on the ideals of Ubuntu and the Baha'i religion, right? Constructive resilience in Baha'i religion philosophy. And it talks of decolonization not as dismantling, which a lot of decolonization is about, but as a process of taking the best of different parts and bringing it together and growing from there. So, Peter, when you mentioned decolonized listening, and I'm already skipping to some of what you brought in, to me, that is the kind of approach to decolonization that we take, where it isn't about one part of the world over the other, or dismantling one thing to, completely throw the baby out with the bathwater, as they say. It is about how do we take the best from different cultures, different worldviews, and build on it together, because in many ways, that is what CLD is about. It is not about just one group of stakeholders. Even in the definition of who a community is and what forms a community, there is a constant interaction that is happening with the community and with other stakeholders, be it the local governments, be it the civil society organizations, be it private enterprises, whoever they are, there is an ecosystem which operates there, right? And every person in the ecosystem has something to contribute and brings in some value, some knowledge, some resource. How do we build on that together?
Thank you, Gunjan. Since you answered the first part of Peter's question, I think, did someone want to take the second part about learning? Yeah?
Yeah, all right. I think the tool itself, Gunjan, I was immediately thinking about the tool. The participatory assessment tool, participatory community-led development assessment tool. That tool has gone through several iterations, in that we would use the tool, and the dimensions are also the framework of that tool. And Gunjan, please add, but we would use that, deploy that tool, we would get feedback on, okay, these elements of the tool, in other words, these elements of the dimension, they need retweaking or they need refinement. And that has happened, right, Gunjan? And so that tool for us has illustrated the learning that is continuously happening within this setup. I do agree with you. Learning doesn't appear as its own its own concept within the book. But there's always, I think throughout the chapters, there are reference to how the community process, the dimension or the act of listening, the act of engaging and hearing, have contributed to these different respective organizations featuring to their evolution and their refinement and their adjustment to local contexts. Maybe you can also speak to that one, talking about context, right? Because we also see that in Matt's chapter, like with the Apgar, and how you constantly had to learn and adjust as you work in different contexts.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly we are and we have to. And I think, the learning processes are very different when you bring a community-led development. The facilitation approach is very different than the sort of norm in international development bureaucracy, where reports get written and get sent to Ottawa or Geneva or wherever, and don't ever get used with communities. I think the other kind of learning that we really try and focus on is we have communities of practice within our organizations, so really trying to get learning going across the organization. And we're also, maybe to pivot a bit to Erica's question as well, there's a lot of potential for virtual to add to this work. I mean, so one of the things that we have is there's an Advocacy Foundation Learning Hub where knowledge from the community is turned into learning and educational products that are made freely available to everyone. So we have courses on the community mobilization but it's not just the civil society side of things. It's courses on how to plant a mangrove tree and how to grow all sorts of different types of plants and things like that as well. One of the things I wanted to say about the virtual. So we've worked for a very long time with community-based savings groups, and about a decade ago, there was a push towards virtual community-based savings groups. And in theory, it sounds like a very good idea because there's kind of an accountability there, a transparency there, and a virtual platform. It's very efficient, but we actually end up going a little bit away from the virtual because the face-to-face is so important, right? I think that everything we do, the focus on place, the focus on community building in place is so important that then there's a huge advantage in the virtual. We put out some various apps during COVID, but they were much more successful where they were overlaid onto places where people had, interpersonal connections and where there were community mobilizers that were going out into communities. So I think there's a lot of value in the virtual, but the virtual can't replace the in person. I also want to speak to your question. The question I was most excited to respond to is your last one about the kind of new conversations in the aid space, because a lot of people are finally getting excited about local philanthropy, community philanthropy, and local resource mobilization. There's a recognition that I think there's an increasing recognition that no one is going to be able to step in to fill the gaps that are being left in budgets. No one is going to be able to step in. But if civil society is to thrive globally over the long term, then there needs to be a reorientation away from minority world sources of funding towards local sources of funding. And so one of the things that we do is we actually track with our local civil society partners. We have a global indicator that tracks the amount of resources that they raise from local resources for local development every year. And in 2024, that figure was $12.4 million equivalent in local resource, and that's community contributions, it's local government contributions, it's the private sector, it's local foundations, etc. And if if that $12.4 million was a single project budget, it would be the Aga Khan Foundation's largest single project anywhere in the world. And I know, I recognize, that Kenya is not the same as Mozambique, and that the potential for local resource mobilization looks different in different places. But this is definitely a major focus I'm hearing in conversations that I'm part of as the sector has changed.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm aware that we're running low on time. People are are having to go, unfortunately, to other places, even though they would love to stay here. I think we should go online to answer maybe time for 2 questions online, and then those in the room that still have questions could maybe stay after the recording ends. Okay. Sorry, Marina, to you.
Yeah, so we've just had one great question come in. It's quite long, so if I can, Bo-Ran Lee, who asked you, if I can summarize, the question essentially is about appropriate evaluation approaches. So many people are still being asked for results-based management type evaluation that cannot capture meaningfully what is happening within a CLD process, but also the point about timeframes, right? Evaluation is always looking at what a program has achieved, whereas CLD processes take longer. So that's the question. If I may take 2 minutes or 1 minute to briefly provide a response to that and pick up on the question, Erica, you asked about the kind of evidence, the moment we're in, and whether different forms of evidence are being sought. So I would argue that from where I sit, being quite involved in many conversations globally about innovating and evaluation approaches in order to understand complex processes of change, such as the ones that a CLD approach is geared towards, etc. There are a lot of methodological options out there, right? We know how we can be learning oriented. We know how we can meaningfully understand complex causal processes of change. I think in some of the conversations I've been involved in, including with the World Bank, is that the shift in the aid landscape means that a lot of the funding for the RCT type evaluations, a lot of that was US money, and a lot of that has gone, right? So there's a conversation in those of us using complexity-aware theory-based evaluation saying, okay, now's a moment for us to really push forward without having that sort of confrontation that you constantly have to have, right? And actually show, not just tell, but show how these approaches work. And so I think that links a lot, Gunjan, to the work you guys have been doing on realist evaluation, which is a conversation we've been involved in, right? So approaches that have room within them for CLD congruent, participatory, deeply participatory methods in bricolaged forms that can help us build the evidence base.
Very quickly then come in and just pulling together a lot of different strands of what different people have brought in. Starting with the learning thing, I think, as Matt said, learning is in context, but learning for us was also something which was very implicit and explicitly a part of the local resources and knowledge dimension. So there is the local knowledge and resources dimension in the framework that we talk about, because a lot of CLD is not just about learning. I would argue it is about unlearning a lot of what we've been taught. So in the movement, we do unlearning labs. In fact, we had the unlearning labs on community-led monitoring, evaluation, and learning for the last 1 year. We've been running that on what is it that we need to change and unlearn about what we know about questions of rigor, data, other things, right? And Marina, as you said, these conversations are now opening up. They're taking place. I think the book is a case in point. When we first went to Routledge, they were like, we only publish PhDs. We were like, great, there's a whole bunch of people who are PhDs in life. Does that count? Right? But we are seeing these shifts happening. We are seeing shifts in how journals are publishing things also happening. For the first time that we know of, we had a community listed as a first author for a journal article, sharing their experience of monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So these things are happening as we speak. On the place thing, I do want to very quickly say that I think that's a continuous debate that goes on within community-led development on the importance of the physical space. And there is a value to it, because even for migratory communities, right? At any given point in time, when they migrate, they are in a space. And the relevance for a physical space in the movement, when we thought about communities for a very long time, was because, well, a lot of this is about access to basic services, human dignity, right? Health, education, all of those things, water, sanitation, and they happen in physical spaces. And so there is an alignment in terms of some needs which are there, which are in a physical space and are in the physical world. And that's kind of why we chose to go with the physical definition of the geographic definition of the community. There is another question, Marina, actually in the chat around, meaningful approaches for monitoring and evaluation to apply these principles. And here I just want to very quickly flag what Marina was saying, some of the work that we've been doing around this, but also the tool that I mentioned at the beginning, the quality appraisal tool, because the whole value of that tool was, how do we shift the definition of quality? So that quality is not just about rigor, which is super critical, but it is also about congruence to CLA principles. It is about who is participating, how's the community a part of the process, what roles they are playing, right? All of that is a determinant of quality in evaluations. I'll stop there. Sorry.
Gunjan and Marina and the rest, we do have to end now. Which is unfortunate, because I think all of us would like this conversation to continue. But big thank you to Gary. Thank you very much for hosting us today. And just to say, I think you guys are willing to stick around for a little bit if people have questions that are still in the room. But yeah, big thank you to everybody online. And again, apologies that we ran out of time and couldn't have more of a discussion, but really appreciate everyone joining.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'll have to log off here though.
Yeah.
Cool,
That's
yeah.
fine. Bye, Marina. Bye,
Okay.
Gunjan. Thank you so much.
Everyone.